Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue au Collège Massey. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge the duty of stewardship toward the land, as well as the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. To discuss Canada-US relationship, an endless subject that we really love to talk about. And I think it's becoming it's always at the top of our minds and always part of the news. So I am delighted today that we are welcoming specialists in the field. And without further ado, I'm just going to let Junior Fellow Michael OShea take it from here.
Thanks so much, Natalie, for that terrific introduction. And thank you, Massey, for that beautiful new audio-visual music intro. Before we begin, my name is Michael OShea. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And thank you so much, Massey, for inviting me to be a co-moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm on. Because of COVID, I'm not in Toronto. I'm here in Boston. I'm a settler here in the territory now known as Boston, Massachusetts. Boston occupies the traditional homelands of the Pawtucket, Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribal nations. And while tonight's dialogue will explore the evolving relationship between Canada and the United States, two settler nations that occupy Indigenous land, this is only one of the relationship among the many nations and peoples of Turtle Island or North America. And we hope and expect that future Massey dialogues can critically explore other relationships on Turtle Island, Indigenous to Indigenous, as well as Indigenous settler relationships. Thank you. There's a lot to talk about today, including a new president in the White House, the effects of a devastating pandemic that is still very much with us. Both Canada and the US face intertwined domestic challenges with deep historic roots and are both confronting evolving international crises. We're so lucky to be joined tonight by Dr. Sands and Anne-Marie Fowler to learn where the US-Canada relationship is headed and what's already changed in the last 100 days, the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And I'm lucky to be joined by my co-moderator, Avni, who will introduce herself and introduce our two speakers.
Thanks, Michael. So hi, everybody. My name is Avni Paranjape. I'm a third-year junior fellow and a third-year student in the Faculty of Law. And while Michael is an American junior fellow, I'm Canadian and calling in from Toronto, just down the road from Massey College. So I'm excited that we are able to host this discussion on Canada-US relations from both sides of the border today, coming from two different national perspectives. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground in the short time that we have. So I'll get right to introducing our two panelists for this afternoon. Anne-Marie Fowler is a doctoral student in the Department for the Study of Religion in collaboration with the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. As a 2020-2021 graduate research fellow at the Center for Ethics, she is designing an alternative interpretation of AI ethics that draws from Hebraic temporality, philosophies of mathematics, and the generative logic of Herman Cohen's neo-Kantianism. Bringing prior professional background in finance, social entrepreneurship, philanthropy, and public policy, she seeks to apply temporal design parameters in the computational setting to questions of justice and equity affecting systems of central banking, digital currency, and sovereign debt. Thanks for being with us, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
Our other panelist today is Dr. Christopher Sands. Dr. Sands joined Massey as a senior fellow in 2019. He is director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and is an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Based in Washington, D.C., but originally from Detroit, Dr. Sands has been studying the relationship between Canada and the United States for more than 30 years. He earned a BA from Macalester College and an MA and a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University. So welcome to Dr. Sands, welcome to both of you, and thank you for being here with us today. So it's been about 60 days since the inauguration, 60 days into a new presidential administration. It seems both so long ago and so fresh at the same time. What changes have we already seen in the Canada-US relationship since Biden has become president? And how does the interpersonal style of these two leaders, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, affect diplomacy in this context? And I'm curious, perhaps Dr. Sands, you could tell us about what you've observed about how these two leaders are interacting and how those interactions are already shaping this relationship.
Sure, and I'm glad to start, but I'm interested to hear what Anne-Marie thinks as well. Having seen several presidential transitions from Washington and watched how that has affected the Canada-US relationship, there was a reassuring quality to the beginning of the Biden administration's approach to Canada. The things that you normally expect to see, an early call between the incoming president and the prime minister. We had a call on November 9th. We also had the first call from the White House to Prime Minister Trudeau. We also had the first virtual visit, sadly because of COVID, not a person-to-person visit, but the first virtual bilateral. And this is an important distinction because there was a G7 meeting hosted by the British that came up sooner, but that was a virtual multilateral, and this was a virtual bilateral between the U.S. leader and the Canadian Prime Minister. But it also included many of the members of the two cabinets who sat in on that conversation, and was followed up by a meeting with Secretary Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, with Marc Garneau, Canada's Minister of Global Affairs. And so all of those things were a signal of normalcy. This is what we expect to see at the beginning of the administration. And by and large, those meetings pulled off without a hitch. And so it was a good start to the relationship and familiar, unlike the Trump years, which were, well, best forgotten.
Thank you, Dr. Sands. And perhaps, Anne-Marie, I can turn to you. What have you observed about the way that President Biden is engaging with Canada in these early days of his administration?
I observed, early on that a lot of the moves were very well choreographed. And that told me that this was well planned, that Canada was chosen as the first contact. And this wasn't surprising to me because then Vice President Biden told Justin Trudeau that he had to hold down the fort for the liberal international order, for the rule of law, to be that representative in North America during the time between the Obama administration's conclusion and whomever the next president was to be. As it turns out, it's him. So he's coming back and saying, thank you. Now, what do we do now? And I think what we'll talk about also in relation to that is there have been some executive orders and some announcements, also, again, very well choreographed to indicate the normalcy that Professor Sands just mentioned. And I think that they've done that very successfully. And I think that that deserves some credit because we're in a very, very unusual time. We can't have face-to-face meetings and the benefits that those give. And so I think that amidst all these challenges and obviously a very first priority of vaccines and combating COVID, that it's been very positive so far. And it has been, as Professor Sands said, reassuring. And I think many, many were looking for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Avni. So my next question is about the domestic economic policies of President Biden. In some ways similar to President Trump, there's a theme of economic nationalism. For Biden, it's a call for reinvestment in domestic manufacturing, the slogan, Buy American, for example. So I wonder how this might affect Canada-US relationships and Canada-US trade in the future. And I'll let Anne-Marie take a first stab at this question.
Okay. Biden's statements were definitely indicative of economic nationalism, but I saw them in a very, very different way. And because I'm coming at this from an American perspective, even though I am a graduate student in Canada now and enjoying it very much, so I'll invite any critique and disagreement. But here's my view of it. President Biden right away came out and said, we're doing this. It was January 25th, I believe. And so this was a very, very early priority. Now, the easy way to look at it is to say this is a signal to those in swing states that may have in other situations not voted for a Democrat, not voted for him, and perhaps voted for Trump in 2016. So you have here, you know, I'm looking after you. Thank you for coming out to the polls, voting for me. This was not this was a close election. So in that way, that was kind of the easiest explanation for this. But there's something else to it. And that is that a lot of the burden of stimulating the economy and being kind of a protector of the economy during this unusual time and even before has fallen on the Federal Reserve and on the central banking system and on monetary policy. Now, Biden saying buy American is stipulating that a certain amounts of money that are going to be concurrent with some very, very large spending bills are going to be injected into industries in the United States that make things. Why is this important? Because when we have moves in interest rates and other monetary methodologies from the central bank, a lot of that easy money and, you know, injecting more money into the system finds its way into financial securities, which can be anything from the stock market to investment real estate, to NFTs, to fine art. They don't necessarily go into what is kind of colloquially called the real economy. When a president is saying buy American, he is from a very central position saying we are going to inject money into the more traditional sectors that make things in the American economy. So this is not necessarily trying to put Canada in an uncomfortable place. It is saying I need to prioritize the economy at this very, very perilous time. I also need to emphasize vaccines. I also need to emphasize just the morale of the country. So we have kind of a fiscal thing to do here, and we have a fiscal task to complete, is what I meant to say. And we have also a political task to complete. So he's kind of doing both of those at once. There's another thing that it does. It being so early on, any executive order so early on is a reset button of sorts, and it indicates to Canada, we want to come up and have a conversation with you about how this is going to work. So, you know, I'm going to press a reset button. This is my executive order. It is not a continuation of the previous administration. Now, you're the first person I'm calling. What are we going to do about this together? So I saw this actually as a politically astute move on President Biden's part and less a continuation of the economic nationalism of Trump.
Wow, thanks so much for that, Anne-Marie, and for including those nuances. Dr. Sands, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, any agreements or disagreements?
No, I agree fundamentally with Anne-Marie's take, but I want to draw attention to what might be driving it. There's no hiding the fact that the United States remains a very divided country. And it's divided in a number of ways. We've heard about red states and blue states and other splits between the country. But one of the most important is that a younger generation is moving into a position of dominance in our electorate. And that's a generation that includes millennials and, as we say south of the border, Generation Z. We don't say Z, but it's the same thing. That generation is now the largest block of voters that we have. And for most of my lifetime, the largest block of voters have been the baby boomers. The baby boomers, we all like to tease them, and you know, they're familiar, they're that parental generation, but they're beginning to retire. And COVID certainly hasn't helped because it's put some of them on the back foot in terms of the political activism that had been a hallmark of their careers. So as this rising generation comes forward in both the Republican and the Democratic Party, our national leadership has struggled because they really aren't of that generation. Joe Biden is a member of what they call the silent generation, the generation that preceded the baby boomers. He understands the politics of those times and is trying to communicate and remain relevant to voters today. And it's a precarious position. Many progressives are impatient on social justice, on environmental action. They want their priorities to be top of mind. And at the same time, the Democratic Party in this transition is struggling to hang on to the blue collar voters of the working class. who had traditionally been a Democratic constituency, and much of Joe Biden's career was about speaking as someone who grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to that community. And yet now many of them have turned to vote for Donald Trump and for an economic nationalist message. And so, as Anne-Marie said, there's a lot being communicated with the way the president is approaching things, but what's driving it is the precariousness of his position. I'll just add one other layer. Because Congress in the House and the Senate is in Democratic hands, so nominally they're responsible, the margins are very, very thin in both chambers. And it's exactly 50-50 in the Senate, with the vice president having to be on the scene to break ties. That means that it's difficult for the president to impose his vision or to insist on his agenda. He needs to bring people with him. And because he doesn't quite have the ear for the rising generation, he's trying to square a lot of circles. I think you've seen in that a caution that reflects maybe his weakness as a president in this particular time. That doesn't mean he can't get things done, but it also means, I think, for Canadians watching from up north and wanting to see the U.S. have a good outcome, I would keep your expectations of the Biden administration somewhat in check, not because Biden isn't looking to have good Canada-U.S. relations. He's just constrained by the importance and the complexity of domestic politics. So he's going to be looking to home a bit more than he looks abroad, at least for the early days.
Thanks so much, Chris. So you've heard about Biden's strengths and his weaknesses. If there are comments or questions out there, I'm sure there are, you can begin asking them in the chat. And in about 10 minutes, we'll be drawing on some of those questions for our panelists. I'll turn it back to you, Avni.
Yeah, Dr. Sands, I'm really glad you brought up political polarization because that's what I was going to ask about next. Because even in Canada, we can't really get away from the political vitriol of, especially this past presidential election campaign. It's really been impossible to ignore how its effects continue to proliferate through American policy and culture in so many ways, from public health, the pandemic response, obviously, to public safety, with these very recent, very heartbreaking incidences of violence, to really everything in between. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a bit more about how you see this political polarization in the United States affecting the relationship with Canada beyond perhaps Biden's hesitance to look too far beyond his own borders and focus on domestic concerns at this time.
I think that's a great question, Avni, and it kind of goes to this this dilemma of American Republicans and Democrats like Canada. Canada is not a partisan dividing issue, but our politics color the way we look at issues, whether it's the Keystone Pipeline or Buy American, because we're so focused on our own divisions. One of the things that may make sense for Canadians in the Massey community who are watching this is to think in terms of that good versus evil discourse. I met Prime Minister Trudeau. I've met Erin O'Toole, spoken with some of the leaders in Ottawa. I think they disagree. I don't even think they always like each other, but I don't think Justin Trudeau wakes up and says Erin O'Toole is pure evil. Just not somebody he likes, but maybe agrees with. But on a human-to-human level, there is a very important respect, which is part, I think, of Canada's, I know sometimes teased by Americans, good manners, very gentle, kinder, gentler society. In the United States, there are many people, and you don't have to look farther than cable television to find them, who feel that, first of all, Donald Trump is the embodiment of evil, that his motives are evil, that he wants to do something bad to people, whether it's immigrants or others. And now with Joe Biden, there is a discourse of the destruction of America, the flood of illegal aliens. It's an order of magnitude more polarized. It's not that we aren't divided, and you're right to say Canada's divided too. We all have divisions. But the divisions have been of that order in the United States, where it's very hard to find common ground. It's very hard to find respectable, middle-of-the-road policies, because everything is life and death, good versus evil. And I think it's only been amplified by social media, which allows people to get more attention if they're the more flamboyant critic, or if they have the best zinger lines. And so we've let that somewhat take over public discourse and have not really preserved space which we have at Massey, which I think is a great thing, for a respectful exchange of views that accepts as a premise that the other person is a good person who just wants to disagree and come up with common ground. It's just something absent in the United States, and it worries me a great deal, although in the long run, I think American politics will find their way to reset, but we're just in that tense period.
Yeah. I briefly worked in Canadian federal politics, and I'd say your assessment is quite correct, that there is at least a sort of fundamental level of respect that is shown between politicians, at least in the public sphere. Even if there are, there is underlying animosity, it's going to stay below the surface as much as possible. Though it's certainly troubling, as someone who is a political watcher in Canada, to sort of see the way that American political vitriol influences our debates at times and our political conversations. But I would say your assessment is quite accurate. So, Anne-Marie, what are your thoughts about American polarization and how it's affecting bilateral relations?
Well, I was thinking back earlier when thinking about what Joe Biden's position with the younger generations is in terms of just explaining what things used to be like. And even I have been in the position of someone telling me, it was a younger graduate student, that, oh, it's always been this polarized in the United States. And I looked at her and I said, no, actually, it was very different. And I can, describe some very specific differences, which Joe Biden kind of came up through because he's had a very long career. But one that kind of stands out is in the 90s, with the election of Bill Clinton and Al Gore, the Democratic Party really moved more to a center pro-business position and became the party that was in power during the time when tech was starting to be on the rise. And so there was this kind of look toward the millennium and the future and all that. And at that same time, Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America came to be. However, at that time, there was certainly a lot of back and forth and a lot of brinksmanship. But at the same time, it was a game of experts and a game of intellect. And it was a playing back and forth. And it was something that Joe Biden knew how to do very well. And that is what has deteriorated. And at this point, that game of intellect, instead of being directed around policy itself, is directed on how to make the other person powerless. So it has gone from an issue level to an ad hominem, very, very personal level. And what has happened is that legislative bodies have now become so much about taking the power away from the so-called other side, that anyone that does want to talk about policy is really talking about the action of the courts or actions at state level, possibilities for, what are the opportunities that federalism in the United States offers, even though federalism in the United States does have kind of a look toward the president sort of characteristic to it. So you have Joe Biden coming in, knowing the power of the presidency, but also knowing that the legislative body that he knew and worked in is no longer effective in the very, very same way. And that's not going to change overnight. One thing I do want to mention about the polarization, and this has come up in my own past research work. I did some research in a very major swing state to the south of here, Pennsylvania, that was related to a retail purchase and political donation startup I worked with. And I ended up talking to a lot of voters that had a certain political affiliation party-wise, but tended to vote for the other party. And I was trying to capture kind of their reasoning and also capture how a startup could maybe be predictive of which direction they were going to go in which election. So it was a really interesting project to have, and this was about a decade ago. And at that point, I realized that a lot of the decision making, a lot of the polarization happens very, very much on the left and on the right, and the two often have very, very similar strategies, although very different positions on, say, social issues. But there's this big group in the middle, and they kind of fluidly go back and forth between candidates, but they do not feel a sense of affiliation with any political party. So I think that it's not that there are half Democrats and half Republicans. I think that there are this large group of just, can we try to figure this out? And why don't we talk about issues anymore? And how do I get involved in my community if it's all about fighting with each other and I can't say, I'm against fracking in my town, or I'm against this part of Obamacare, but I do think that the overall plan is very, very well thought, etc. So there's a lot of questions, and they are not accommodated in this vitriol. And so there's a lot of wondering, and this came up directly in my interviews. Where do I go if I want to have a civil conversation? And that's a very good question.
Thank you.
Oh. What a provocative way to end your segment, Anne-Marie. It gives me a lot to think about here. Hopefully these Massey dialogues or these the question answer form can be maybe one way to have a civil discussion that's too often missing in our cities, our small towns, everywhere really. So I don't have an easy question for you. This is also one that incites a lot of strong feelings and is polarizing, which is pipelines. One of Biden's first acts was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. It was cheered by indigenous, progressive, and environmental backers. Trudeau, expressed disappointment with the move. And I see there was a question from the audience on this same topic. So that's great. Good to see your question, Sasha. So what might this portend for both U.S.-Canada trade relationships, but also indigenous land rights and the future of the fossil fuel economy in Canada? And I'll direct that one to Anne-Marie first, and then to Chris.
Okay.
Keystone
is there's a lot in there. I'm just deciding, what do I start with here? First of all, Biden gets at least an A- on choreography once again, because rather than deciding whether to continue with something that Trump had put in place, he decided to cut it off immediately. So he performed a reset. Any discussion he has now with Prime Minister Trudeau is going to be about what happens next, not what happens next with this pipeline. I think that he has canceled it. I think it's a serious cancellation. But what are we going to do next? And the issue at first, it kind of came up from my, again, American perspective, which anyone can push back on. It came up because environmental groups originally wanted to look for an issue that they could draw up to make a point with. And there was this application sitting there for a pipeline, and they said, oh, here we are. And the protest began for very, very good reasons. Ogallala Aquifer, there could be damage. Also, there could be major damage to indigenous lands and to, this isn't thought through. And are the jobs that are going to be created by this project really, really what are being predicted? And so all these very good questions. But what happened with it is it handed the Republican Party a tool by which to put then President Obama on the spot. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, but the Keystone was put into a bill where it had to be decided in a very, very brief amount of time. President Obama was a very deliberative and careful person. He was someone who would have looked at all the reports, and they were saying, no, you have to decide right now. So Obama had to say, no, stop. And so he was put in a position where he was made to look like he was not listening to the economic interests, the energy interests, the interests in the central part of the country, and certainly many swing state interests. So that was an issue that was politically useful to the Republicans, even though it originally seemed like it was going to be politically useful to the more progressive environmental movement. And so there was an inadvertent coalition built, which put the president in the center in kind of a difficult position. So fast forward then, President Trump brings it back. It's an exact opposite thing that he can do, very politically convenient, and I think a good decision on his part for his constituency. And so President Biden coming in had to make a decision. Do I continue this and try to tweak it, or do I just cut it off, and say, let's start over because this has been a little complicated so far. And I think he made the right decision in doing that for a lot of reasons, because the pro reasons have questions attached to them. However, I don't think this is the last infrastructure project of its kind. I think there may be another one, but the next are going to be more situated in what would a 21st century, not a 20th century, but a 21st century energy project that the United States and Canada could collaborate on look like? And what would we do in terms of protections, of respects of those who are to be affected? And how would we really assess what the job creation and what the economic productivity of this would be? Because having been in finance before, anything having to do with a commodity is very, very sensitive to pricing and to markets and to conditions, and to make any prediction about what sort of investment is going to go into a project and how many jobs are actually going to be created by it that aren't going to be technologically handed off is not so easy. So I think some of the projections of how economically productive the pipeline was going to be need to be looked at. I do encourage President Biden to look for more infrastructure projects with Canada in the very near future, but to put the 21st century label on it, to say how many different kinds of energy are we looking at and why, and what is going to be safe and be the most productive to what our real goals are here, both economically and in terms of energy security.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. Chris?
Well, I think the Keystone Pipeline is a perfect illustration of the dilemma that we face, because it brings in many factors a little below the surface that are part of why American politics has become so difficult. Let's start with the issue of the presidential permit. The United States created a presidential permit process for any infrastructure that crosses the border. The test for a presidential permit is, does the project that needs permission risk U.S. national security? That process was created by an executive order, and there's an executive order that guides the process of making those decisions, which prior to the Obama administration had not been political. They were simply made in a quick assessment, most of the time not even getting a report in the paper. Those of you who live near Detroit, my hometown, will know that the Gordie Howe Bridge project, the new crossing between Detroit and Windsor, was given a presidential permit by George W. Bush after a short review, and it was not particularly notable. I do think the Globe and Mail covered it because it was Canada, but otherwise it really didn't draw any notice. But as Anne-Marie said, many environmentalists were looking for an issue early in the Obama years that they could focus on to make their point about the problems of climate change. And they were very angry with Barack Obama, who had come into office and gone to Copenhagen to the UN climate talks and come home with a deal that had the US making significant reductions on an 80-year timescale, and China, India, other developing countries not making any serious cuts. It was a disappointing resolution because it forestalled action, but it was the best deal that Obama could get. This made Keystone and the Keystone XL pipeline extension more politically salient, because a president who had disappointed on the big stage of climate change was expected to show that on a small project, one that he had control over a permit, that he blocked this pipeline in order to send a message about not relying more on fossil fuels. Now, Anne-Marie's right. Many of the critics raised questions about the science, what were the benefits, what about a Guava aquifer? What she didn't mention was all those questions were answered. They were answered by people who said, yes, new pipeline technology is safer. Yes, we've carefully routed around the aquifer. But this is an illustration of the lack of dialogue in US politics. People were making points to the crowd, but not listening to answers, demanding answers, raising questions, but not listening to answers. And so there was no reasoning together that brought us to a position of agreement. Now, when President Trump came along, he used an executive order to give the permit to the Keystone Pipeline. It's still it's just ruled by decree. It's something Edmund Burke would have been appalled by. It's something King George III of England did, and that's why we left, because of this sort of arbitrary decision making. Trump did that. as Obama had, and now Joe Biden's come in, he's done exactly the same thing. I think a society in which the rule of law is not made by the legislature and elected officials make decisions by fiat leads not to compromise, not to common ground, but to further polarization. And I don't know if any of our Massey friends are hoping for the Keystone Pipeline to go forward, but I don't think you can say this chapter is dead yet. And the reason is, if President Biden is replaced by a Republican, unless we reform the process by which we make these decisions together, very much what Anne-Marie was saying, the idea of building infrastructure together requires a process of doing things together, not arbitrary decision making. And there's no final victory if the next person can wave their hand and sign an order and reverse it completely. But this sense of total victory over the other side, victory without compromise, is very much the Washington mode now. And I think even when the ends might seem to justify the means have a cost. And the cost has been further polarization that has been very, I think, bad for American politics.
Very good points. Thank you.
Yeah.
No,
I think before I get to my next question.
Sorry. We're not supposed to talk over you. Sorry about that.
No worries. I think I'll take a question from the audience because I think it's quite on point for what you just said. And so I'll just wait for it to come up on the screen here, again from Sasha Kostenko. So is there a role for Canada to play in reestablishing issues-based political dialogue in the United States in sort of a similar way that we play in that role in transitioning democracies? Very interesting question. So perhaps I'll direct that to Professor Sands first.
It's an interesting thought. I spent an earlier part of my career working on democracy assistance in a number of countries. And so I'm familiar with that work. And of course, Canada does it well, not only through Canadian NGOs, but actually many of the American NGOs that are working on democratic development have Canadians working for them, some very nice ones. So it's a very interesting thought. I remember at one point I was interviewing for a job at the Hudson Institute, which was a think tank here. And one of the members of the board was Canadian. And I had gone through some interviews with board members, and someone asked, well, do we really want an American to study Canada? Couldn't we find a Canadian? Wouldn't they be cheaper? And she said, no, because the problems of Canada's relations are often Americans. Americans who don't understand the importance of Canada and the economy. And the problem with Americans is they don't listen to anyone else. And so that's how I got the job. So I feel that there is this sort of sense that Americans are just so full of themselves or so used to looking to our own for answers that we would be astonished if Canadians thought they could teach us anything. I don't think that's necessarily our best quality, but it is one that makes things complicated. I'm going to add another dimension in that. Because I think it goes to something that's interesting about the Canadian-US relationship. Professor John Curtin, who is at Trinity College at the University of Toronto and a very good friend of mine, made the observation that by and large, the Canadian foreign policy community is liberal internationalist. There are outliers, but most people are in the liberal internationalist tradition. And so when they present positions on international issues, whether they're bilateral with Canada-US or the future of China, Russia, you name it, they begin from those premises and they frame their arguments in those terms. That's great because that's how Ottawa thinks. And so the politicians and the advisors are in line. One of the things that makes American advisors on foreign policy, many of my peers at the Wilson Center and around town, different, is that in the United States, there is a strong market for realist foreign policy. Boots on the ground, how many tanks and missiles do you have? How many dollars are you putting into this? Pay to play, that's how we have to do it. It's a very hard, seemingly very realistic way of viewing things. And so those of us who operate here, if we're talking to members of Congress or to the Biden administration or even the Trump administration, couch our arguments about what's best to do in those theoretical or, if you will, ideological kind of frames. And I think that sometimes makes the Canada-US relationship more difficult because we are talking about the same things, but referencing different terms and navigating in that space, which some of us try to do better and worse depending on the day is one of the interesting things, because the common assumption people have that Canadians Americans are so alike falls apart when you start getting beneath the surface and looking at these issues and recognizing that we often approach them from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And Anne-Marie, would you agree with Professor Sands' characterization? I saw you sort of nodding along there.
Yes. I've been nodding along. Yeah, I think what does happen is that coming in, speaking on the theoretical basis about the liberal international order and rule of law, etc., there is this small group of people that instantly say, oh, yes, I get that. And there's this large group of people that say, no, wait, I think I know what you're saying, but I'm not sure, which is what Professor Sands just described. But I was thinking just around the outside of that there are places of interaction of Canadians and Americans that are not necessarily directly about issues, but they relate to issues. And one of them is H-1B visas for, technology for skilled workers or immigration issues. Canada is very open. We had the Trump immigration policies, and you had a lot of people writing op-eds and things and saying, oh, my technology company is moving up to Canada, or Canada just pilfered the workers. I wanted these highly skilled immigrants because I couldn't, go through the paperwork, etc. So we have an issue there that Canada has been helping with quite a bit, maybe not even trying to, but showing an example of, this is how you do it. This is the right way. It is the pro-business way. It's also humanitarian. It's all the right things. The other side was, there's always this uncomfortable, interesting comparison. For those of us who studied the great financial crisis in 2008 and 9, there's always that moment, well, why didn't Canada collapse in the way that the US did? Well, Canada followed the rules better. I mean, that's a very, very generalized statement, and I actually am able to go into that in a lot more detail, but I won't here because we'll be here for hours, but literally. Canada approached the whole situation differently and came out relatively unscathed. The United States did not have that privilege. And you have really a comparison very close together of actually interlinked systems that dealt with a crisis differently and had different experiences of it. And I think that was another policy situation where Canada was setting an example that we wouldn't necessarily copy, because the situations are not exactly the same, obviously, but there were lessons to learn which were not necessarily yet absorbed by the United States. There is a way of seeing problems that have to do with design, methodology, and practice, and thinking, oh, let's slap a regulation on them. Or let's put some, let's take this very, very delicate little filament and hit a hammer on top of it. It's not going to solve your problem. And I think that perhaps a dialogue between the US and Canada, but how did we go about this problem in a way that was gentler, but actually more effective and more specific to what solution we actually needed at that time? Because I think the regulatory solutions, some of them that came from the United States after the crisis, were frankly not sufficient, or were too sufficient to a point of having bad side effects. And so I think that's something that President Biden eventually may have to look and do some unwinding of, because our banking system is changing rapidly, particularly with the recent Fed actions versus COVID, expanding the amount of money in the system. And we're going to need to go back and fix some things that we didn't do right the first time. Could Canada be part of that? Maybe.
I think that's an interesting point, Henry, because there is this back and forth between the United States and Canada, and there's really no side that always gets it right. One of the things about the United States is that we have all our political debates in public. We let it all hang out. You hear every wacko view as well as a lot of the mainstream views, and sometimes the more eccentric views get more attention. They're more entertaining, I guess. But take, for example, vaccinations. The U.S. did something which is quite American, which is turn to the private sector, put a lot of government-funded research into their hands, and just go. Clear the regulatory space and try to generate vaccines. We also delegated the decisions about closures of the economy to our states. And so Canadians looking south of the border could see some states that were open and people weren't wearing masks, and other states where people were being, quite strict in the way that they shut down the economy. And in the American political space, that's just part of the debate. There are people who say, oh, I wouldn't want to be California now, or I wouldn't want to be Texas. But we have those debates using the states as almost laboratories of reform, to use Justice Brandeis's famous phrase about American federalism. Now, contrast it with Canada, and I don't mean this in all a negative way, but in Canada, you had a much more centralized process. There was more control and order coming from Ottawa. Yes, the provinces deliver the healthcare services, but the federal government was supposed to try to get vaccines and bring them and get them approved. And the US system was messier, but got to a good place more quickly. And now Canada can learn a little bit from the US, hopefully get some of the vaccines. I know President Biden has sent some north. We want to send more, and that will be positive. But I think it shows kind of where each of us is strong. And in this messy way that we have conversations, there's a famous line from Winston Churchill that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing only after they've tried all the wrong things first. We do have a tendency to do that. But at the same time, I think in some ways we sometimes get things right in a way that can be beneficial to Canadians. So I guess maybe this is the problem of being an academic. I can't accept that one side or the other side is always right. I always have to say, but what about this? It's very annoying, I'm sorry. But I just want to speak up for the US. Sometimes it gets it right, and it's a good thing.
I think it's interesting that you raised that example of varying restrictions in different states, because we've certainly seen that in Canada as well. The provinces have had a lot of control over how to manage their own pandemic response. And so you've seen, for instance, the Atlantic provinces doing very well, completely locking down, initially cutting off their borders. And, from my understanding, people can have a much more relatively normal life in those parts of Canada compared to my home province of Saskatchewan right now. In fact, my hometown is locked down due to high incidences of the UK variant. And so you sort of see this this patchwork of different policies in Canada as well. And there's actually been domestically a lot of calls for greater federal control of vaccination schemes. There is no national vaccination database to coordinate those kinds of efforts. So you're seeing more of that sort of call, but largely I think the Prime Minister has left it to the states. So perhaps I'll Michael, did you want to ask a question? Because I've sort of been asking a lot.
Sure,
in the
yeah,
last few minutes.
please keep your questions coming. We have about 12 minutes left in our conversation. Alexander, thanks for both your questions. We do have a question in the chat from Melissa, a double question. I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen there, which ties into the border closure. What is closing the border for this long do for the relationship between both countries? And is Canada's strict border closure causing problems for the relationship? And you'll see a follow-up question there. So maybe I'll direct that one to Anne-Marie first.
Well, for me, it was kind of not the best news to realize that my planned trips back to the United States were not going to happen for a little while. But I think in general, the border closure is very understandable. And I think it was just a very sensible, unfortunate, but very sensible thing to do. So my first answer is I do not think it's affecting the relationship. I think that when we are able to open the border again, I think we need to be ready with a lot of things to talk about what happens next. It's like we've been through this very hard thing together. What do we do now to cooperate even better going forward? So I don't think it's as much going to affect the relationship negatively as open up both an opportunity and I think a duty and obligation to have that conversation once the border is open. But I think that it just was very, very understandable under the circumstances.
Thanks. And Chris, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the border closure.
I do, and I think it's been a really interesting experiment, like so much else related to the COVID experience. I had grown up in a border state, was used to traveling back and forth, and I'm old enough to remember when you could do it without a passport, just a driver's license. And in fact, I'm so old that when I was going to high school, the drinking age in Canada was lower, but we could get alcohol at 18 in Michigan, and so people came over to drink in Michigan rather than us going over to Canada, which is my little brother's experience. So there you are, properly old. But the border is an experience, a phenomenon that you feel differently when you live near it versus when you live in the interior. And there's no getting away from the fact that more Americans live away from the border than Canadians do. More Canadians live close to the border. So the border is a more abstract thought for a lot of Americans, but it's a very important reality for a lot of Canadians. And I'll talk about a couple of broad categories for why. There are communities that rely on the fact that there is a fire brigade across the border with an extra truck, which has allowed them not to have as many firemen in their volunteer fire department, because in an emergency, the neighbors come across the border and help put out the fire. There are communities with limited healthcare facilities, maybe a local doctor, where there's a more sophisticated clinic that is across the border. And we see this in a lot of Canadian communities where if you're dealing with routine daily care, you can rely on what's available in Canada. But if you want to pay a little bit more, but you want instant service, you can cross the border for the MRI scan in a more expedited fashion, or for a surgery that may be elective. Those patterns have been severely disrupted. And that's not even to talk about strange communities like Point Roberts in Washington, where they're completely cut off on a peninsula that the 49th parallel divides, so that they can't even go to high school in Washington State because they can't get off the peninsula because they have to go to Canada for it. So those are even more extreme situations. The longer this goes on, the more the costs pile up. And I think on 9/11, 2001, we saw the Detroit-Windsor border closed for approximately 20 minutes, and the consequences for the economy were quite severe. Companies readjusted their supply chains, began keeping larger inventories because there was now an element of border risk. I think if I could go back in time and say to those companies, there would come a time when the border would be closed for all but essential traffic for a year, they never would have believed me. I think we're moving in that sense backwards. And what we learned on 9/11 was that the blunt instrument of closing the border was not the most effective way of dealing with very narrow, targeted threats. We would have been better to end up where we have now, where we use a lot more data to look at actual threats and leave most traffic go back and forth across the border unimpeded. Similarly for COVID, Anne-Marie's quite right. We lack the database. We lack the information. We lack the ability to screen, even do COVID testing at the border. And so we've decided, well, the safest thing is to do nothing. Let's shut the border down. The longer that goes on, though, the bigger the cost economically, socially, for families that are divided. You hear the stories of people who've got an elderly loved one who's in hospice care and they can't go visit them, even up to the point that they're dying. We've heard that domestically too. People aren't allowed to visit their loved ones. So those are really harsh measures. I think going forward, we have to figure out a way to manage the border jointly in a more smart way. But at the same time, we have to try to make sure we learn the lesson of this so that we never again have to close the border. There will be more pandemics. There will be future problems. That's almost guaranteed. But I take some hope from the fact that the reason the Trump administration was willing to restrict the border in this particular case, rather than banning all travel, which is what we did with China and Great Britain and Europe, was that there was so much trust between US and Canadian border officials having worked together well. So they felt that they could rely on each other, and so we could at least allow the essential traffic to go. Without that, I think the economy in both countries would be severely hit. So we're better than we were. We're not where we should be, but this is an excellent example of something that I think in the short run made some sense, but is becoming more costly all the time. We have to find a better way to manage.
It reminds me of some of the historic strengths between Canada and the U.S. that maybe endure regardless of who's in the White House or who's in the cottage on Rideau. It reminds me of that famous JFK quote, that's carved into the rotunda of the U.S. Embassy. I don't have it in front of me, but point is that history and geography and necessity have made the two countries allies and friends and natural cooperators on some joint challenges. So we're just coming up on 5 minutes here. So unfortunately, we're out of time for further questions. Those hours gone quickly. So I'd like to give both panelists a time for some closing statements or some forecasts for the future. So since I've been picking on Anne-Marie a lot first, I'll ask Chris to go first.
Well, I think I'm going to end where we started, which is about this strange time in which we're living, in which there is a social change as younger people move into positions of responsibility. Our politics will change as well. It's clear always when I'm in Canada, and certainly when I'm in Massey, that the younger generation is often more willing to sit down and try to understand the other side. It's not just a slogan about tolerance and inclusivity, it's an actual hunger for that. And I feel that US politics will improve as that generation rises, but transitions are bumpy, and I think we're going to continue to see those kinds of bumps. One thing that the border has made more difficult is that we talk about each other more than we talk with each other, because we're separated by this border, because we're not flying as much. Even the president and the prime minister had their first visit virtually on, I hesitate to say Zoom, probably it was something top secret from the Pentagon. But however it goes, we've had this period of separation, which I think has reminded me anyway of how important it is to keep up the dialogue, to keep listening to each other as much as talking to each other and with each other. That's something that's been the Massey spirit from the beginning. And I think it's something that is very well preserved there. And I hope, if nothing else, we'll be able to have more dialogues like this as the US goes through its transition, as Canada goes through COVID, because we really are, to borrow from that Kennedy quote, friends at the end of the day, and we should remain so. And we can do more together than we can do at odds with each other. And that's the Massey spirit. So I hope we could advance that a little bit here and maybe in the months to come.
Thanks for hopeful sentiment there. Anne-Marie, closing thoughts?
I agree with all of that. I just wanted to add, I think a word I was just thinking of is improvisation. I'll tell you why I'm thinking of that. When there's a relationship of trust between two countries, everything doesn't have to be so predicted or controlled. I think when one goes into a negotiation where there is some question about whether one is going to get all the information, etc., there is a tendency to control, and the policy framework and the agreement framework and the whole relational framework is going to try to make sure everything is predictable. I think one wonderful thing about the US-Canada relationship is that the two countries are still able to surprise each other in a good way, because there isn't a level of fear that would prevent that. And I think that once the border is open, we have to take as much advantage of that as possible. And I spoke to a few industries or industry areas that I think would be especially important, but I think we can open this up to quite a wide variety of different topics. But I think the relationship is definitely a very, very special one. And even as, for example, President Biden reaches out to Europe, going through a lot of structural changes at this point, a lot of discussions with China, a lot of questions about Russia, for example, Canada comes in as a partner, not with the same goals or exactly the same position, but a trusted friend that can give advice and can be a collaborator. And I look forward to watching that happen.
Some very compelling final thoughts there. Thank you to both Anne-Marie and Dr. Sands for such a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion today. There's so much to keep an eye on in the coming months and even weeks, and this discussion has certainly helped me refine what to focus on in this very unique bilateral relationship as it moves forward. So thanks to both of you. Thanks to Michael, my co-moderator, for organizing such a great afternoon. And thank you to the audience for watching and participating in this Massey dialogue on Canada-US relations. We've had a great afternoon, a very stimulating afternoon. So have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Avni.
Thank you.